Well, I'm going to change pace a little bit, or direction a little bit, compared to the previous speakers. We've heard, first of all, from the first two speakers, the reaction to things that have either been climatically or geologically induced, earthquakes, floods, and things of that nature. And from the latter two speakers, for pandemics that have come around from a biological source. It may be a bat or something like this that is then transmitted onwards. When we come to nuclear power and the nuclear industry, that's quite different in some senses because it's totally man-made. So I'm actually going to be talking more about man-made disasters or potential disasters, which of course could have been induced by one of these other phenomena, for instance, a tsunami, as we saw in Fukushima. Remember, two of the disasters, or what are called disasters, they weren't really disasters, that are talked about, 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, were basically operator-person induced. The one in Fukushima had some operator involvement, but was of course mainly dealt with caused by the tsunami. The other thing that's, I think, a little bit more different about these shares something with the pandemic, but not so much with the more geological activities, is that the impact from a nuclear disaster, let me call it that, can have an effect in a number of areas, in a number of countries, even though it only begins in one. So like the pandemic, it's similar to that, but not like perhaps an earthquake. It can also have a different effect because it can change the climate in which people talk about the issue of nuclear power and bring certain responses which may be actually a great danger for the long-term future. So bear that in mind. This is really something, nuclear power stations were things that men made, women made, and invented. And so therefore, the way I'm going to talk a bit about it is going to be somewhat different from what has gone on before, but we'll share some common strands. So, the first thing about nuclear disasters, the first thing to do is to prevent any occurring. And that's the emphasis I want to put a lot on in this case, because we made the nuclear power plants, we can also put in the measures that prevent things going wrong. So, the first thing that you need to do is that you must have a very good licensing and approval scheme for any nuclear facilities, and operations. And I don't mean just the nuclear reactor plant, I mean the way in which you fabricate fuel for these plants, and then what you do with the fuel after you've taken it out of these plants. And that when you actually approve this cycle, you should have a very good safety case, you should have a very good security case, because we worry about terrorist type of actions, and we should have a very good safeguards case. We know that there is no loss of materials that could be being used for nefarious reasons. So that's not universally there at the moment in licensing any nuclear activity. And by the way, it's national regulators that license activities, not international ones, although there's a large amount of work based on the IAEA international protocols, which means to say that the same sorts of standards are being applied. But every approval does not yet contain a safety case, a security case, and a safeguards case. Now, the other thing that I think is important, and it's similar to what some people have been saying here, is that because all of that is done on a national basis, there's no international regulatory body, then it's absolutely vital that you have international scrutiny and peer review of various national approval schemes. So it's vitally important that there is this cross-country, cross-nation peer review. to make sure that we're always approving facilities in the same sort of way. This is a complicated slide, but the two main points of it is that, of course, you should, I'm talking about here about fuel cycle arrangements, because these are the things that have not had as much attention yet as the earlier parts of the process of the fabrication of fuel and then the operation of reactors. You can get tremendous benefits from international fuel cycle arrangements. Here we're moving things out of a national environment into an international one, where you have a few sources of production of fuel and then disposal or reprocessing of fuel. You're located in one or two places around the world, or three or four or five, but an identified number, so therefore you can gain control and ensure that what is done with it is dealt with well. Of course, along with that, there comes problems, and one of the classic ones was the problem of AQ Khan, and Urenco, which was then, it is still, the international company which produces fuel. Of course, you can always steal things, and then you can always misuse information. That's the danger with having these things, people from all nationalities involved in an international activity. You can get them performing basically criminal acts. I want to emphasize that there are a number of areas which we've not yet dealt with, and that is in the areas of used fuel and radioactive waste. The important thing here is that we've got to deal with this from nuclear reactors, and as well as the earlier stages. It's what you really want, every country, every nation wants access to a safe and a secure management and disposal of the fuel and high-level waste that it produces from reactors. So I'm emphasizing a little bit this area, which has not what had the attention in the past. How would you get to that position? Because there are a lot of sensitivities involved in international operations like this. Well, one of the things I want to point out here is that the way you can make a start in this in the scientific and the technical world is to do collaborative research and development on how you deal with this fuel and this radioactive waste. You've got to make sure that you're conscious when you have a nuclear power program that you've got to deal with this right from the beginning, and that you've got to have plans at the appropriate time. But the virtue of research and development is that this is scientific activity, and that's the sort of thing that is easily done across national boundaries. I like to say, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the fact that science has no national boundaries. Science is the same wherever you are in the world. Scientists collaborate easily across national boundaries. It's a good way of starting to establish the communication that you need to do to make sure you have good ways of dealing with your spent fuel and with your radioactive waste. And in the longer term, those research and development partnerships can actually generate the confidence to have more permanent relationships across boundaries for this aspect of the nuclear power program. Let me just tell you one or two things about what happened consequently on those accidents that occurred in the past. After 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, there was a World Association of Nuclear Operators was set up. And that was an industry-wide body, it was industry-led, that met to consider the operation of nuclear reactors and to promote safe practices in those operations. Now, we've had 25 years of safe operation of reactors through that time. And let me remind you, with a lot of reactors that were very old, were designed in the 60s and the 70s, just as the Fukushima Daiichi reactors were designed, at least the ones that were the trouble was with, on that time scale. So modern reactors are different from those older reactors. A lot of wisdom has gone into the design of those newer reactors so that they are inherently safer. And that's across all of the industry. They, of course, should expand their remit, these WANO, to looking also at the fuel that was coming out of those reactors, the spent fuel, and stored in the nearby ponds, which you've heard so much about. Looking at the whole operation of this exercise is important, but actually the industry has got to do this. They're the best people. They know what's happening in a reactor plant. They're the best people to be able to spot, in principle, the difficulties and also to fix them. So they have got to be part of any solution to any of these problems that we talk about. If you move forward, you've got to ask, what else in my original group of three things? We talked about the reactor operation and safety. That was with 1.0. I said that's not my area I was going to spend a lot of time talking about. But these other areas, security, there is just being set up a World Institute for Nuclear Security, which will come out with many of the requirements for a good security case. That should have buy-in from the industry as well as support from governments worldwide. There should also be a similar body that worries about non-proliferation. And that's, one can suggest, that doesn't exist at the moment. Here we're trying to make sure that you get the CEOs of industry to realize that these are important issues for the whole of the nuclear industry. Those operators, that industry, have got to be engaged. All of this has to be done on an international basis, because if we have a problem in one country in the world with a reactor, as you've seen, it spreads everywhere. It has an effect everywhere. It can have a direct effect with the plume of radioactivity going up and being blown across onto other countries. That's a very physical activity. The other one, it can be that you get issues that change climate for decision making for how much nuclear power you have in your energy mix for the future. So, we need governments then to consider how to develop treaties and provide that international overarching regulation. Finally, I think in the case of a disaster, I'm going to repeat what other people have said here. For every one of these things, information is absolutely essential. There's got to be transparency for the, in the situation. And people have got to be able to immediately cooperate. There's already a great deal of cooperation in the nuclear industry because of things like the IAEA. There are a lot of links, one country to another. They have to be improved and increased. And you must be able to use all of the information that you can locally and internationally. And I'll give you a small example of that. I believe that in the case of Fukushima, worldwide there are stations to check the CTBT treaty. In other words, to ensure that there are no underground explosions or occurring for weapons. Those stations also contain, they can do radiological assessments of wind-borne, atmosphere-borne elements. I believe that was all available, but the agreements were not in place to use that immediately. So therefore, you did not get a complete picture, you didn't get that contribution to make a complete picture of what had been released in Fukushima. There are things like that where the information exists, but is not released straight away. So, in summary, I think to make sure we men and women who've made the nuclear power, given us the nuclear power ability, we've got to make sure that there's rigorous national licensing of all facilities and the commerce that you will have between countries to make those facilities work. Rigorous licensing is essential. As it's still national, then I think you've got to have international security and peer review in the absence of those international regulatory bodies, which will take a while to put together, but the other part, scrutiny in the peer review, in principle, can happen a lot more easily and probably could have been beneficial even in the last 10 years. And then to deal with an emergency, then you clearly have to have this transparent international communication using and releasing all of the information that you actually have. Thank you.